Jamie Wilson is a professor of history over at Salem State University. He teaches courses in Black history, history of race and ethnicity studies, and United States history. He's the author and editor of a half a dozen books, including the recently published biography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther King Jr., Life in American History. This academic year, he's the lead historian with the National Council for History Education. And he's helping create a professional development program for teachers in the school district of Osceola County and Brevard Public Schools in Florida. Oh. That can't be easy. That centers around the theme, the power of music during the Civil Rights Movement. He lives in Malden with his wife Stacy and two challenging but lovely daughters. That's his editorial comment, not mine.
That is true. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to the North Andover Historical Society for having me here. Today I want to do several things. One, I want to give a brief presentation that thinks about Dr. King and his work in the post-1965 period, 1965 to about 1967. And then King gave an interview in 1967. We're going to screen that 25-minute clip wherein he talks about the shifting terrain of the civil rights movement. And then we're going to open it up for a conversation. It's not really an ask the professor, it's, what do you think, what things kind of struck you? So the title of my address tonight is More Than a Dream, Martin Luther King, Poverty, Race, and War in the 1960s. Now, by 1965, the civil rights movement had entered a new phase. The Montgomery bus boycott ended 9 years before. The successful March on Washington had exposed King to a national audience. The landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act was signed into law, and King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference was looking to expand outside of the Deep South to bring attention to segregated housing, poverty, and segregated schools there. Now, initially, they're unsure which city they should focus on, so King toured several cities. Now, I'm going to have a little caveat here. I'm going to be using certain acronyms. SCLC is Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and CCO, the Council of Community Organizations. So I'll keep rephrasing those and mention it, but just FYI. So he visited Boston in from April 22nd to April 24th, 1965, where he met with the state legislature, the mayor of Boston, and community groups. At a joint session of the Massachusetts legislature, he called, quote, upon the great legislature of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to be maladjusted until the good society is realized, end quote. And discrimination in housing and employment and education were eliminated. From there, he went to Roxbury, where he visited an overcrowded school. He spoke to concerned parents. He toured a crowded, dilapidated tenement occupied by Black residents. At an evening Passover event at Temple Israel, he told the audience, quote, we are involved in a great and momentous struggle right now to get rid of the tragic yoke around us so long and must remove the pharaohs who still have hardened hearts. The next day, King led thousands of marchers from Roxbury to the Boston Common, where he spoke to a crowd estimated at 22,000, one of the largest demonstrations in Boston's history. Before leaving Beantown, King and Massachusetts SCLC President Virgil Woods met with Boston's mayor. Does anyone remember who the mayor was in '65? Collins, that was close, John Collins. And they present him with a list of grievances and demands. And this includes housing issues. It includes code enforcement, economic welfare, community upkeep, the need for anti-poverty work in Boston's Black communities. And his visit, for the most part, was a success. One Bostonian remarked that King's presence and approach, quote, served to heighten the drama of the plight of Boston's Negroes, and, quote, to show that Selma exists in Boston. He and the SCLC decided that Boston was not the proper place to stage their first Northern campaign, so they scout out other cities. They go to Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. They go to Washington, D.C. Those weren't proper places, they thought. So on July 6th, King met with Al Raby. Al Raby was a devoted local teacher, an activist, and chairman of the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations. And he asked King to help them in their efforts to desegregate Chicago's public schools. And the discussion is meaningful. And King said, I'll think about it, and he would return within weeks. Now, I'm sure you know, by the 1950s, Chicago had been a destination for Black migrants from the Mississippi Delta for decades. And during the early 20th century, and by 1950, Black economic achievement in the city had provided opportunities for Blacks to move throughout the city, but residential and educational prospects were limited. But King returned to the Windy City on July the 23rd, and he wanted to consult with local activists and tour the city's Black neighborhoods. And after fruitful meetings in Chicago and conversations with the SCLC staff, Chicago becomes the site for the organization's first Northern campaign. Chicago was not like any other city, or any Southern city, I should say. And King could not count on blatant racist attacks by the police to garner publicity the ways that he could in previous campaigns throughout the South. Northern moderates were not easily condemned for de facto segregation. So careful planning was needed to create an effective movement. And the organization took the summer of 1965 and the autumn of 1965 to develop a plan. And during that time, King is crisscrossing the country. He's giving speeches. He's raising money for the SCLC as he and the organization continue to plan the Chicago movement. And in September, he goes to the Black press, and he has an article. It's called "Why Chicago is the Target." And in it, he says he's not there for personal aggrandizement. It's not an ego trip for him, but the reason that King and the SCLC are in Chicago was because he says, quote, the existing deplorable conditions and the conscience of the good cause that called him to the city. The Chicago movement kicked off in early January 1966. And it kicks off with a press conference. And in that press conference, King says, quote, the Chicago problem is simply a matter of economic exploitation. He goes on to compare Black ghettos to internal colonies and European colonialism in parts of Africa. And he revealed that the movement would be a multifaceted one that pressured city, state, and federal agencies and assisted the social and political development of Black residents who resided in the slums. Several weeks later, King and his wife Coretta and members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference moved into a rundown third-floor, four-room apartment in the Lawndale neighborhood in Chicago's Black West Side. The apartment is without light, It's without heat, hadn't been maintained by the landlord, but they settle in anyway. They settle in with a few sparse accommodations that they get from a secondhand store and they get from donations. And living in the community, King welcomes poor black neighbors into his home. He talks to them about the challenges that they face. And the black neighbors welcome him into the neighborhood. In his spare time, he visits pool halls. If you look at several of the images in the black newspapers, there's King in his suit, his preacher suit, in a pool hall with a pool cue. He hangs out where black people are hanging out. There was a gang. The leaders of the local gang walk around with King to show him what's happening in Chicago. One black Chicago resident writing in the Chicago Defender commented that, quote, King's living, even for just a little while, among the poor. He will be in a better position to tell Mr. Charlie what he ought to do about the Negro problem. At times, the black residents asked him for help. One cold night when the temperature dipped well below zero and the heat had not been turned on, residents in one building asked King for help, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference purchased coal to burn in the building's furnaces. In mid-February of 1966, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the CCCO implemented a new tactic. Residents of a nearby rundown building close to King's Chicago apartment approached him and reported that their rodent-infested apartments had no heat and necessary repairs had not been made. So what King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference do is they assume trusteeship of the building. And trusteeship called for tenants to submit their monthly rent payments not to the landlord, but to the SCLC, who would then hire residents to make the repairs and pay them a fair minimum wage for their labor. King spent several days with Raby, Coretta, and the SCLC staff dressed in work clothes, shoveling coal and repairing the property. And they knew that assuming trusteeship of the property was an experiment, and they intended to use it to help determine what King called, quote, the kind of creative social planning that might reverse this trend of degradation of our nation's cities and bring new life and new hope to the slums of the cities. Such creative social planning also encouraged King to meet with Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, who made the city his home and the organization's home. To come to Chicago and not meet with the elderly Elijah Muhammad would have caused many black Chicagoans to doubt the sincerity of the Chicago Freedom Movement. Now, despite negative depictions of the Nation of Islam in the mainstream media, black people in Chicago knew that black Muslims had created businesses in their neighborhoods. They had helped rehabilitate many who had been incarcerated. And while the Nation of Islam did not believe in integration and openly advocated self-defense, King and Elijah Muhammad somehow agree that they can work together. The meeting is cordial. They both agree that blacks had been systematically isolated in ghettos, and vowed to work together to create more residential opportunities for blacks and improve slum areas. I'm going to go off script here for a moment. I wanted to write a book about newspaper columns that Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad wrote. Now, if you ever read the autobiography of Malcolm X, there's one sentence where he says, I wrote for the Los Angeles Herald-Dispatch and I wrote for the New York Amsterdam News. So I collected all of these columns that Malcolm X wrote and Elijah Muhammad. There were over 300, I kid you not, and I compiled them. But I didn't know who owned the rights to them. You know, you just can't print anything you want. I called everybody. I even called the Nation of Islam. You don't call the Nation of Islam. I was bold and brazen. And one day, I kid you not, I was in my office in the summer and I was checking my voice messages. And I kid you not, there is a voicemail from Elijah Muhammad. Now I knew Elijah Muhammad. They say he's mysterious. And my heart sank. I was like, what? I had to get myself together. As it turns out, it was the grandson of Elijah Muhammad, named Elijah Muhammad. The book never got off the ground, but I did end up writing a marvelous article called Come Down Off the Cross and Get Under the Crescent, the writings of Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. We'll talk about that later. So during the early part of March 1965, King and the Chicago movement worked feverishly to organize a gala to raise funds for their work. On March 12th, close to 13,000 people attended the Freedom Festival at the city's International Amphitheater and were entertained by some of the most important black entertainers of the 1960s, including Sidney Poitier, who was the master of ceremonies along with Al Raby. By 1966, many of you know, Poitier had become an international film icon, the first black actor to receive an Academy Award for his portrayal of Homer Smith in what film? Lilies of the Field. It was on the tip of your tongue. Entertainment was provided by Mahalia Jackson, Elizabeth Lance, Harry Belafonte, and Dick Gregory. Jackson, of course, Mahalia Jackson, King's favorite gospel singer, he was noted to have said, began singing gospel music when she was 4. She made her first gospel recording in 1934. She had appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1952, where she received national attention as one of the greatest gospel singers of her generation. Elizabeth Lance was a noted rhythm and blues singer. She began her recording career with Motown in the early 1960s. As the civil rights movement gained traction, Lance joined with Harry Belafonte at SCLC benefit shows. Belafonte, of course, began his acting career in Harlem, New York, and he won his first Tony Award for his performance in, this is a hard one, John Murray's Anderson's Almanac in 1954. Shortly after that, of course, he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Belafonte performed and recorded several calypso albums and became a popular black folk singer. Dick Gregory, of course, was a Chicago resident and comedian who had participated in SCLC campaigns throughout the South. King was the keynote at the event, and his remarks at the Freedom Festival were, I think, his most direct and insightful. It was easy to look at southern cities and point directly to racial discriminations and violations of African Americans' constitutional rights, he told the audience. but it was necessary to turn attention to racial discrimination in northern cities such as Chicago, where blacks were forced to live in what he called a domestic colony, where they were, quote, dominated politically, exploited economically, segregated and humiliated at every turn, end quote. Because of systemic racism in mortgage lending firms, real estate agencies, and racial covenants. Exploitation in housing was directly connected to de facto segregation in schools. Living in ghettos meant that black children attended inferior schools, received inferior educations, which eventually led to poor paying jobs or welfare dependence. To bring an end to slums and exploitation of blacks, King said that it was necessary to organize and participate in, quote, sit-ins, stand-ins, rent strikes, boycotts, picket lines, marches, civil disobedience, and any form of protest and demonstration that are non-violently conceived and executed, end quote. The Freedom Festival was a resounding success. It brought in close to $100,000. After the Freedom Festival, King continued to traveling the nation, speaking and raising money for the organization. And in each talk, he sought to raise awareness about the structural economic inequality facing millions of blacks in urban northern cities, and he offers a variety of solutions to intergenerational poverty, including, but not limited to, an annual income guaranteed by the federal government. The organization's Operation Breadbasket, their work in Chicago was led by Jesse Jackson, that Jesse Jackson, who at that point was a theology student. And he boycotted and picketed a local dairy company demanding a more inclusive workforce, which led to the hiring of over 40 black workers. And the campaign provided a necessary victory for a movement looking to gain traction and maintain its appeal to black Chicago residents and white moderates who continue to support the movement. On the heels of the boycott, King announced in late May that the Chicago movement would rally on Soldier Field, a popular sports and entertainment venue in Chicago later in the summer. And he was hoping to bring together 100,000 people dedicated to the economic transformation of black ghettos nationwide. And on July 10th, with the temperature close to 100 degrees, tens of thousands of individuals, black and white, they gathered on Soldier Field for a Chicago movement rally. The rally was set to begin at 3 p.m., but those in attendance, those in the know, arrived several hours early to be entertained by the local popular disc jockey Herb Kent, again, Dick Gregory, the musician and Chicago native Oscar Brown, the Andrew McPherson Jazz Band, the folk singer Peter Yarrow. Coretta Scott King started the rally by singing the national anthem. And most notable among those joining King on the podium was Ralph Abernathy, his friend and vice president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Edgar Chandler, the white Protestant minister and the director of the Church Federation of Greater Chicago, who had supported King and the SCLC in their Selma campaign. Ralph Hellstein, the Jewish president of the United Packing House Workers of America, and Al Raby of the CCCO. Now, some in the crowd, they had heard of those speakers, but most came to hear the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who, though born in Georgia, came to Chicago, put his life on the line and his nonviolent ideals to the test to expose the contradictions in the Windy City. And as he had done times before, King reminded his audience of the importance of nonviolent mass resistance. Speaking to the thousands present, he said, quote, "We will be sadly mistaken if we think freedom is some lavish dish that the federal government and the white man will pass out on a silver platter while the Negro merely furnishes the appetite," end quote. Nonviolent direct action was important, but not enough, he told the crowd. Voting was critical to force Chicago's Mayor Daley to enact measures to address housing discrimination in the city and to force politicians to earn Black people's votes rather than taking them for granted. It was also necessary, King said, to build coalitions with other ethnic groups who were suffering racial injustice and to work together with progressive whites. At the end of the rally, King and thousands of supporters marched to City Hall and fastened a list of demands on the door. In the days after the rally, King and Raby and members of the CCCO and SCLC met with Mayor Daley and his officials, but the negotiations stalled. Neither side wanted to compromise, and recognizing the stalemate, the Chicago movement did as King said at the rally, to dramatize, quote, and expose a social evil with the tramp of marching feet. And in late July and early August, King and the Chicago movement began marching to white real estate agencies demanding a change to exclusionary practices. The movement also took the struggle outside of the confines of Black slums and into Chicago's white neighborhoods to contradict the prevailing myth that Blacks chose to live in all Black slums. One march took place in the all-white Bridgeport neighborhood, where demonstrators marched to Mayor Daley's home. On August 5th, King led a nonviolent contingent into the Chicago lawn section of the city. And the idea was they were going to walk to the real estate agencies and demand the residential listings be made available on a non-discriminatory basis. In Marquette Park, a neighborhood in Chicago lawn, King and marchers were met by a hostile, violent white mob of thousands carrying Confederate flags, white power signs, and swastikas. They're shouting, "We want King." They're yelling racial epithets. They're throwing cherry bombs, rocks, and bricks. King is hit in the head by a rock. And the Chicago movement, they want to expose white opposition to integration in Chicago, but the participants were stunned by the open white hostility, hate, and violence. Undeterred, the Chicago movement continued its demonstrations. In the weeks after the violence in Marquette Park, movement activists tramped to real estate offices in Bogan Manor, Gage Park, Jefferson Park, West Elsdon, Evergreen Park, and Chicago's other white suburbs. On August 21st, King led a group of marchers into South Deering, a white community in Chicago's far south side. By late August, Al Raby said that the movement, quote, had achieved not everything we wanted, but everything we could achieve, end quote. And on August the 26th, 79 people, including Mayor Daley and members of his administration, realty executives, representatives of mortgage lending institutions, and the Chicago Freedom Movement met at the historic Palmer House, the Palmer House Hotel in downtown Chicago. And they signed a 10-point agreement that addressed discriminatory housing practices and policies. And by signing the agreement, Raby and King halted further demonstrations, which throughout the summer had disrupted the status quo. It wasn't what everyone wanted. Always being the optimist, King saw it as a first step in the right direction of a longer process of housing desegregation. Edwin Berry of the Urban League said that they had achieved, quote, 8.5 out of 9 objectives, end quote. Others, like community activist Clorie Bryant, felt betrayed and excluded. After the summit, she spoke on behalf of many Black Chicago residents, stating that we don't care about summits taking place without us. We want contracts in black and white with some hard answers for us with signatures and some time frames, but none of this was there, end quote. King went back to Atlanta and he left Jesse Jackson in charge of Operation Breadbasket. He returns to Chicago in October, only to find that little had been done to enforce the 10-point agreement, and he threatens to resume protests. So what starts as a noble endeavor to improve housing options for Black and brown Chicagoans ended up with empty promises and no real means of enforcement. Over the decades to come, the same Chicago neighborhoods that King sought to integrate let Blacks and Latinos purchase homes and rent apartments, and then whites fled. Today, Gage Park's population is 90% Latino. Less than 5% of Marquette Park's population is white, while Blacks make up over 50% and Latinos close to 40%. South Deering, that same neighborhood that King went to, the white population there hovers around 2% today, with Blacks making up 65% of the community's population. Those of Hispanic origin constitute close to 30%. King's optimism and his moral compass led him to challenge residential patterns, but little did he know that racism and de facto segregation would change with the times. Throughout the fall of 1966, King became less active in Chicago, and he spends more time discerning his positions on national economic issues as they related to impoverished conditions facing millions of Americans and the Vietnam War. In December, he appeared before the Subcommittee on Executive Reorganization of the Committee on Government Operations. And he urged the senators there to refocus and rearrange national priorities. He questioned the investment in space exploration while citizens of Earth live in slums. Quote, without denying the value of scientific endeavor, he noted, there is a striking absurdity in committing billions to reach the moon where no people live, while the densely populated slums are allocated minuscule appropriations. In speaking about the connection between underfunded anti-poverty programs and the war in Vietnam, he urged the senators to reappropriate billions of dollars used for what he called ill-considered warfare in South Asia and use them for a war on poverty that had become scarcely a skirmish. A guaranteed income was part of a larger restructuring of the national economic system that required critical investments in affordable housing and quality education for all Americans. He also noted that the civil rights movement had entered a new phase that was more focused on basic economic issues and the whole problem, he said, of housing and education. For over a year, he had been reluctant to candidly present his opposition to the war in Vietnam, allowing Coretta's peace work to speak for him by proxy, for fear that a bold stance would weaken the civil rights struggle and jeopardize his relationship with elected officials like Lyndon B. Johnson. And now he decided that it was impossible to work for nonviolent change and the poor at home when the nation was violent against poor people at home and abroad. Furthermore, he says, if nonviolence was useful domestically, then it had to be used internationally. Prayer and meditation led him to a new position. He decided to, quote, never again be silent on an issue that is destroying the soul of our nation and little children in Vietnam. And in 1967, he would become a vocal and publicly vilified opponent of the Vietnam War. And by linking the civil rights movement with the anti-war movement, he then pushes the Black freedom struggle into a new arena. And as he says in this clip that we are about to watch, by 1967, that dream that he spoke so eloquently about in 1963 had turned into a nightmare. And with that, we'll move to our clip. So this is an interview that King gave in 1967, about 11 months before he was assassinated, wherein he's talking about, I'm sorry, I have to go back. He told me not. What's that? So this is a clip. I said I was going to stand here at the podium, and then I'm walking away. So in it, he's talking about the ways in which the freedom movement is changing, how his ideas are expanding, and the importance of thinking about, poverty, race, and the war in Vietnam. All right, here we go. And after that, we'll come back for a community discussion.
Three, Civil Rights, King, Manoka, roll 20, sound 36.
Dr. King, this church is as good a place as any to go back over your commitment to the civil rights movement. When you went out from here into university and then you went to Montgomery, Alabama and started the bus boycotts there, what was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and nonviolent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country. Of course, that particular struggle and that philosophy centered on breaking down all of the barriers of legal segregation. So I would say that in that period, the basic thrust for the gaining of citizenship rights for Negroes was to end the humiliation surrounding the whole system of legal segregation.
Dr. King, was there something peculiar to the place where you started and the kind of people you attracted? I mean by that, there was a strong attachment on the part of your parishioners in Montgomery to the church. They were older people, weren't they?
Yes, I would say by and large they were older people who participated in the boycott because they were the ones using the bus more than anybody else. And Montgomery was a community predominantly church-centered, so that it was very easy to get to the vast majority of Negroes because they were in some way connected with a church in the community.
Was there, in addition to your commitment to the idea of nonviolence, wasn't it also the only thing you could do, the white community having the monopoly on violence, that if you had tried violence, they would have met it with violence? It was the only device open to you, wasn't it?
Well, I put it another way, that morally, I was led to nonviolence because I felt that it was the best moral way to deal with the problem. We were seeking to establish a just society. And it was my feeling then, and it is my feeling now, that violence is certainly much more socially destructive, and it creates many more social problems than it solves. So I was led to nonviolence for deep moral reasons. Now, there is no doubt about the fact that in our struggle in Montgomery and all over the United States for that matter, nonviolence is also practically sound. It would just be impractical for the Negro to turn to violence. He has neither the instruments nor the techniques of violence. We are about 10 or 11% of the total population of the nation, and I would say we're about 1/10 of the firepower. So it would just be totally impractical and unwise and unrealistic for the Negro to think of violence. Well, I saw this in the beginning in Montgomery, but this wasn't the basic reason that I turned to nonviolence and that I believed in it as a philosophy. I turned to it because I felt that it was the morally excellent way to deal with the problem of racial injustice in our country.
Is there something about nonviolence that made it, and I use that in the past tense, that made it more useful among Southern Negroes than the ghetto Negroes of the North?
I wouldn't say there's anything that makes it more useful to Southern Negroes. I think it is true that we've had more nonviolent movements in the South because the problem for many years was more crystallized and, in a sense, more visible in the South. We didn't have many civil rights activities on a massive scale in the North until 3 or 4 years ago. So I would say that we just haven't had a chance to experiment on a broad scale with nonviolence in the Northern Ghetto. I have the feeling that nonviolence is as applicable and workable in the Northern Ghetto as it is in the South. Now, there's a larger job there. The frustrations at points are much deeper. The bitterness is deeper. And I think that's because in the South we can see pockets of progress here and there. We've really made some strides that are very visible, and every Southern Negro knows that he can do things today that he couldn't do 4 or 5 years ago. Whereas in the North, the Negro sees only retrogress, and he doesn't find it as easy to get his vision centered on his target, the target of opposition, as he does in the South. Consequently, this is made for despair, and at many points cynicism, a feeling that you can't win, and it simply means that we've got to develop in the North a massive job of organization and mobilizing forces and resources to deal with the problem in the urban ghettos of the North, just as we've done it in the South.
Well, in the South, particularly in Alabama, you had visible villains, Jim Clark, Bull Connor, cattle prods, police dogs. But in the North, you don't have those visible villains. Isn't it hard to get your people aroused and directed at something that isn't visible?
Well, that's exactly right, and this is what I was saying when I said it's harder to see a target. In the South, in the nonviolent movement, we were aided always, on the whole, by the brutality of our opponent. It isn't the same way in the North. The other thing is that you don't have legal segregation in the North as you do in the South. So it is much more difficult to get people to see exactly what you're doing, but it isn't an impossible job. It's a hard, it's a tedious job at times to get people to be aroused from their apathetic slumbers, but I still feel that Negroes in the North can be motivated just as they were motivated in the South. And I think as time goes on, with the growing economic deprivation in the Negro community, it will even be easier, because people will come to see that not only is something wrong in general, but something is wrong in particular in their own economic and housing situations.
Well, what is it? I mean, how do you find it? It's very subtle in the North, is it not?
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions. People don't have to be reminded that they are forced to live in slums in many instances, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all of these things, and more they're coming to see them, because before the people of the North were looking to the South and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they're coming to see that their problems are very real and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger, and then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in '64 and even in '65 with the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question. And this, it seems to me, was the greatest expression of the hypocrisy of many of our citizens and many of the senators and congressmen of the North.
But isn't that part of the dilemma now? That people knew that Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is much deeper, and I think one during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. and honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we're getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Do you think white people in this country, and I'm talking about non-segregationists, people devoid or thinking they're devoid of racism, do you have any idea of what they want the Negro to be in America?
Well, it depends on the level that we are talking here, because I think you have to make a distinction between the people who are genuinely and absolutely committed in the white community on the question of racial equality. And I must confess that I think they're in a very small minority. I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far. It's a kind of installment plan for equality. And they are always looking for an excuse to go but so far.
Why are they looking for the excuse? What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
That's a part of it, and that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. If you use something as a means to an end, at that moment you make it a thing and you depersonalize it. The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here and changed, treated in very inhuman fashion. And this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So slavery was justified morally, biologically, theoretically, scientifically, everything else. And it seems to me that white America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma. And that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Apart from wanting to live better, which all of us want to do, to raise one's children in a better way, to be better, does the Negro in America know what he wants to be?
I'm convinced that almost every Negro in this country, other than those who have been so scarred by the system that they become pathological in the process, and we all have to battle with pathology. Nobody really knows what it means to be a Negro unless one can really experience it. And I know we all have to battle with this constant drain of a feeling of nobodiness. But in spite of this, I think the vast majority of Negroes in this country know that they want to be people, they want to be men, they want equality, period. It just boils down to that. And we haven't been able to be people. We haven't been men because of all of the conditions that we've lived with and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding conditions, whether it's in housing, or in the economic area, or in schools, or in the vicious credit practices that we face in the ghetto, and all of the problems of closed doors and constant defeats. But in spite of all this, I think we all know, basically, that we want to be men. We want to be persons judged not on the basis of the color of our skin, but on the basis of the content of our character.
But you know that many young Negroes don't want anything that smacks of the American white middle class. But do they want something that smacks of whatever is the black middle class? Or do they just not want bourgeois values, which after all are the basis of this democracy?
Well, I think we have to see what they are saying. I would be the first to agree that integration does not mean giving up everything that has an Afro-American taint, so to speak, a background. I think there are certain unique things within any culture and certain cultural patterns that when you get to the process of amalgamation can really lift the whole culture. And it seems to me that integration at its best is the opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. I think the other thing that we've got to see is that these young people are saying that there must be a revolution of values in our country. As Jimmy Baldwin said on one occasion, what advantage is there in being integrated into a burning house? And I feel that there is a need for a revolution of values in America, because some of the values that presently exist are certainly out of line with the values and the idealistic structure that brought our nation into being. Unfortunately, we haven't been true to these ideals, and many of the values of so-called white middle-class society are values that need to be reviewed and re-evaluated, and in a real sense they need to be changed. So I think the young people in the Negro community who are raising these questions are raising some very profound questions about our total society. In other words, they are saying that there must be a restructuring of the architecture of our society where values are concerned. And with this I would agree with. So in the quest for integration, I think we can offer our whole nation something, because there are three evils in our nation. It's not only racism, but economic exploitation of poverty would be one, and then militarism. And I think in a sense, and in a very real sense, these three are tied inextricably together, and we aren't going to get rid of one without getting rid of the other.
When you stood on the Lincoln Memorial that day in August '63, and you said, "I had a dream," did that dream envision that you could see a war in Asia preventing the federal government doing for the Negroes, preventing the society doing for the Negroes that which you think had to be done?
No, I didn't envision that then. I must confess that that period was a great period of hope for me. And I'm sure for many others all across the nation, many of the Negroes who had about lost hope, saw a solid decade of progress in the South. And in 1954, which was, 64, 1963, 9 years after the Supreme Court's decision to be in the March on Washington, meant a great deal. It was a high moment, a great watershed moment. But I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments. And I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go, and that we are involved in a war on Asian soil, which, if not checked and stopped, can poison the very soul of our nation.
Dr. King, even if there had not been a war in Asia, would you still not have had this nightmare insofar as the Negro movement for equality then touched on two things that the white community holds sacred: their children and their property?
Oh, I have no doubt that we would have encountered great difficulties, great problems of resistance if the war had not been in existence. So that I'm not going to say that all of our problems would be solved if the war in Vietnam is ended, but I do say that the war makes it infinitely more difficult to deal with these problems. When a nation becomes obsessed with the guns of war, it loses its social perspective, and programs of social uplift suffer. This is just a fact of history, so that we do face many more difficulties as a result of the war. It's much more difficult to really arouse a conscience during a time of war. I noticed the other day, some weeks ago, a Negro was shot down in Chicago, and it was a clear case of police brutality. That was on page 30 of the paper, but on page 1 at the top was 780 Viet Cong killed. That is something about a war like this that makes people insensitive. It dulls the conscience. It strengthens the forces of reaction, and it brings into being bitterness and hatred and violence. And it strengthened the military-industrial complex of our country, and it's made our job much more difficult, because I think we can go along with some programs, if we didn't have this war on our hands, that would cause people to adjust to new developments, just as they did in the South. They said they'd never ride the bus with us, blood would flow in the streets, they wouldn't go to school, and all of these things. But when people came to see that they had to do it because the law insisted, they finally adjusted. And I think white people all over this country will adjust once the nation makes it clear that in schools, in housing, we've got to learn to live together as brothers. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rate, so to speak. It didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. And now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
Part of what I wanted to do with this book is to introduce a new generation to King's life and legacy. Every year in schools, we listen to the famous I Have a Dream speech. Very important piece of oratory. Sadly, most people never listen to the whole thing, right? So, what I'm trying to do in this book is my part is just to have people think there's more to King than that before that speech. There's more to King. After that speech, there's more to King. And if we look at King in 1965 to 1968, he's calling for something that's fundamentally different than what most of us think. A redistribution of wealth in the United States and an anti-war stance. He had an anti-war stance before most people did, and he was just vilified in the media. King, you can stick to civil rights, but you leave this war stuff to the rest of us. So, that's my bit, that's my presentation. Now, does anyone have any questions, comments, or concerns? It's not Ask Me, it's a community discussion for a couple of minutes. And thank you all for coming. We said it all.
I want to see that again.
Oh, my
I could
goodness.
watch that so many times because there were things that surprised me. There was when he, I had to grab my phone just to write down one little thing. I never heard the nobodiness.
Yeah.
You could see on his face the frustration, that place where still preaching nonviolence because morally that's what you have to do. But the frustration, the irritation too, which I can't even imagine how hard it was to hold that line of nonviolence, of being peaceful, of being respectful, of being patient. And then the job gets bigger and bigger and harder and more dangerous and obviously really dangerous.
Yeah, agreed. And by 1967, King is dealing with a new generation of black youth. Remember, Black Panther Party is organized in 1966.
That's right.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is becoming more black nationalist. Stokely Carmichael says, King, we listened to you before,
Yep.
and now we're not listening to you so much, right? So you have all of these different streams of thought that are coming to fruition and gaining popularity. So to hold that nonviolent line,
Yeah.
Malcolm X is assassinated. Kennedy's assassinated. John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy would be, Medgar Evers had been assassinated. So, you have to think, what does it mean? And one of the things that I found so interesting writing this book is that the depth of his commitment to nonviolence as a moral way of life that's rooted in his understanding of a personal God. I mean, remember, King's a theologian too, right? That deep sense of commitment to nonviolence and his religious principles. I don't know how many Americans could do it then or not. So, yeah.
But he was very realistic too. I mean, he said, If we try and raise violence, we're gonna get annihilated.
That's right. So
We're-
it's
we're-
practical
we're
and
outnumbered.
moral, right?
You know, there was no other option.
Always outnumbered, always outgunned, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, being African American myself, you know, the king being pulled over by law enforcement is the same factor that is in some places now that we went through
Yeah.
over the years. I just wanted to throw that out.
The struggle continues, right? We have this notion, oh, the civil rights movement is over. The struggle continues. And I think we can, what I'm hoping that young people and anyone who reads the book will learn that there are tips, there are strategies, there are things to be learned from the past that can still be applied to the present, right? If we, it's not just King, it's all of the black intellectuals and activists of the past.
I was struck by how hard he was working to raise money. And that's why, like, when you talk about the practical stuff, there's very practical, I feel like,
You know, the Martin Luther King holiday, you know, the emphasis is on service. It's not necessarily on activism. And that
For
I
King,
feel
it
like
should be
people
all
expect
rest.
things to change without knowing how hard it is
I know.
and how much you have to work.
He crisscrossed this nation
Yeah.
over and over and over and over and over again. Days on end. It's amazing if you think about how many miles he traveled. Someone said, like the distance, I don't know if this is true. Like he could have been, like, or he went around the earth like 3 or 4 times. just the amount of traveling that he did.
Did he? I just have a question. Did he move his kids when they lived in the?
No, his kids didn't go with
This one,
him.
yeah.
No, they didn't go.
They stay with the grandparents.
They stayed in the safety of
Yeah.
Atlanta.
And my other question is, in your book, do you have the name of the dairy that was?
I don't have. It is in the book, but I can't remember it off the top of my
Yeah.
head.
Well, I'm gonna buy your book.
Or you can go to the library, Peter. You don't have to. I thank you all for coming. Oh, well, yes,
I just got one more.
sure.
I know in New Hampshire they wanted to name the 15th Civil Rights Day and change the name of Martin Luther King Day. How do you feel?
I didn't hear about that or didn't pay attention to it. B, they're never going to change Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
I don't think it is Martin Luther King Day in New Hampshire. I think it is Civil Rights Day.
In New Hampshire, but nationwide, I don't think it's going to be take off like that. But again, that's not. I don't know anything about it. But then again, isn't that about rewriting history and erasing history, right? You call it what you want, but at the end of the day, we wouldn't be where we are without King, plain and simple. But we live in the 21st century now, and we see the writings on the wall, quote unquote, where we try to erase those people, or at the very least, water down their approach. I was in Myrtle Beach a couple of weeks ago, just went down there, rewriting history. And I was on an old indigo plantation. That's what it was, the Ark Plantation. And they had the sign out, and I took my daughters there, like, I want to go see this. And the sign said, this is the historical marker, historical preservation. Workers working in an indigo field.
Oh.
I was like, what workers?
Right.
Workers suggest that you're getting paid.
Right.
They're slaves. But again, watering down history, rewriting history, trying to lessen the influence, at best they try anyway, to lessen the influence of African Americans in that history. But it's amazing. That's why we read.
Please share the question too.
Oh, I was just gonna say that, and I'm just gonna say what I want to say. That is it more saying being more inclusive by, which is what we all want to do.
No,
is
not for me.
Saying Civil Rights Day versus Martin Luther King Day. One,
Okay, we want to be inclusive.
be
I got it.
honest. It's okay.
I got it, but it's King Day. It's King Day. It's King Day. People work for King Day. Stevie Wonder gave concerts for King Day. They passed bills and legislation for King Day. Coretta Scott King worked for King Day. For me, it's always going to be King.
Okay.
But that's just me.
That's another
I
holiday.
believe in inclusivity, but inclusivity at what costs?
Alright,
So then we don't talk about King?
no, not at all, but I think that, I don't wanna water down King at
I hear
all.
you.
But I'm just wondering if saying it more inclusively, which is something we all have been talking about for a long time too,
Okay.
to make it Civil Rights Day is more than just Martin Luther
I
King. It's
can
all those
respect
other people you spoke about, right?
I can respect that, but it's Martin Luther King.
Yeah. I'm just making a
You know,
comment.
and if
But at
that's
the same
the
time,
case-
wasn't it George Washington?
Yeah, but you know,
Years before that?
if that's the case, and I hear you, you know, we want to talk about all the other individuals. So let's not wait for King Day to talk about King. Let's not wait for King Day to talk about. Let's not wait for Black History Month to talk about Black history. I do this every day. I tell my students every day. It's not a surprise to me. I don't have to go out in February, and I appreciate the history of Black History Month. But we can talk about it all the time, and we should. It doesn't have to, you know, again, my students say, well, is it American history? Of course it's American history. You know, so just in that inclusivity, have it all year long, so then we don't have to have, right? I hear it, right? So then we don't have to say, oh, well, we didn't talk about all the other civil rights people. Let's talk about it on King Day. I grew up with King Day, as you can probably see.
Can
Yes.
I just want to give a shout out for there's a relatively small but really great exhibit at the MFA on it's really focused on the women of the Black Panther movement, and the photographs are just amazing. And I got an education just looking at the photographs because I didn't realize everything that they were doing to get people clothes and shoes and education
Free
and
breakfast
food
program,
and
right?
I mean, they were doing everything.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting.
Awesome.
That was without the internet.
Yeah.
And that was without the internet, right?
That's right.
And the other
I'm-
thing I just want to say is that it's really sad for me to be sitting here listening to him and thinking about the dramatic economic differential between the suburbs of Andover and North Andover and the city of Lawrence, and the
Yeah, that's
dramatic, the continuing segregation according to ethnicity that
That's
exists in the Merrimack Valley today.
The struggle continues, right?
It's real.
It is real. As I said in the speech, you know, he went out with his compassion, but little did he know that, you know, segregation, discrimination, racism will change with the times. It always has. Yes.
What do you think about the generation coming along that you're teaching and the reaction that you're getting from them as to their willingness to change the system and all the pieces of the system that have affected this?
I think that young people are dismayed, the young people that I know, but the young people that I know are also engaged. Unfortunately, we live in a world where we don't, I say we live in a world where it's based on a real story, right? The movies, right? Based on something. But we don't really know what happened because we don't read. Part of my problem with young people, or no, not my problem, one of my challenges to young people is to read more. Because we think we know, and I have a 14-year-old. She knows everything. And she doesn't read. Evident. So, yeah, again, I think people, they're dismayed, but they are engaged, and I think that unfortunately or unfortunately, they're the ones that are going to have to clean up our mess. And they will, because like King, I have hope. Like Jesse Jackson, keep hope alive, you know? Yeah.
All right, one more comment. Don't you think though that over the last, almost 60 years, there has been progress?
Absolutely.
And each generation, has
Absolutely.
moved forward in making corrections that need to be made.
Absolutely.
We're not living back in the 60s
No, we're not.
anymore, or the 50s.
I wouldn't be here if that were the case. Absolutely. By no means or stretch of the imagination am I saying that we have not made strides, that we won't continue. Absolutely. Absolutely not. You're talking about integrated schools. I teach at a university where I talk about black people all the time. You don't have that unless you have the struggles of the late 1960s and early 70s with black studies programs. Of course. We made strides, but as King often says, we got a long way to go to make that beloved community. But we'll get there. I never want to end on a sour note. We'll get there. Through struggle. You know, without struggle, there is no progress. Thank you all so much. Give yourself a round of applause. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. I teach at Salem State. If you're ever down there in Salem, come and look me up. I'm always around. Thank you.
Thanks.